Okay, so I'm going to start recording. I know someone has stepped out for a moment here in the room, but we'll carry on as if they're going to be back in a moment. So, at first I was going to refer to my wonderful, well, I'll tell you about it, and then I'll rework it, and then life will be good. So, if you'll notice, I've put in the text channels in Discord what's supposed to be this lecture blog, and what I wanted to do is basically put stuff in there, kind of the highlights, the things I really wanted to make sure that people got. Like I wanted to say, well, we're going to talk about advanced lighting in Learn OpenGL today, and specifically call out a few features that, since I can't highlight on my screen, that as you go through, or if you missed the lecture, you could know to those are the key terms you're going to be looking for, rather than have to sift through all sorts of things. The key terms today, we're going to be the HDR, which is going to be high dynamic range rendering. We're going to be talking about bloom. All right. We're going to talk a little bit about some scene-based ambient occlusion, and the things that enable those are specifically multi-target rendering. All right, so these are things to know about, things you'll see, techniques that are used, whether they're in OpenGL or any other type of game engine or wherever. These are techniques that hopefully will ring a bell as you hear other things referred to. So there's multi-target rendering and also deferred rendering. All right, multi-target rendering, deferred rendering, scene-based ambient occlusion, HDR, high dynamic range rendering, and bloom. Okay, so they're largely under this advanced lighting tab in Learn OpenGL. And I guess the challenge now is it's always a mix of how much topics do we talk about, how much techniques, how much concept, versus actually implementing them. You've probably all run into the situation where it's easy enough to read about something, but then you wind up down in the weeds of some crazy bug in getting OpenGL to do just the right thing, or having an _0 instead of a 0, and that ruins your whole weekend or week or something like that. So here on out, largely we're going to talk about concepts and point you at some things in here so that you can potentially, if you want to find example code and to implement it in your final projects, or just for the future, it'll be there. But it'll be in the back of your head that, yes, you know what these concepts are, and they're likely to start showing up. If we do have that, we'll have a few more homework, more kind of concept-based, as well as that exam in whatever form it takes. So just along those lines, basically I want to make sure that if I were to ask you about gamma correction, you would know what that meant. We talked about, describe the basics of how we did shadows, you'd know what that was about, and so on and so on and so on, right? So again, the Learn OpenGL is kind of our text at this point, so conceptually it's kind of fair game for anything to be asked about. You should be familiar with most of the concepts in here, right? Especially if they'll wind up showing up in my lecture blog or something like that. Now, there's also a couple of other things in there, or there were. I wanted to also get you to install, in case you haven't already. I know some of you have, maybe not all of you, but at least some of you have some version of Unity installed on your computer, which is great. Unity is a free download basically, and free use for small and independent developers and education-wise and so on. So you don't have to pay for it, and it's easy enough to go to unity.com, unity3d.com, get the latest version, sign up for an account, sign up for an educational account, and you get the whole thing. And we're going to be looking a little bit at how Unity does 3D, or how a game engine does 3D. So I'll do some kind of demonstrations on that. And it'll be nice to have it on your machine so you can try some things, some model loading and see what that's like there. We'll look a little bit about how textures wind up being used in there, how the lighting system works, and potentially even some of the shaders, materials, and that sort of thing as well. Mostly from a 3D perspective, but there's also some interesting stuff going on in 2D. Some people have expressed a particular interest in that, and we're going to let them kind of show off that capability in their projects and things. We'll look at the kind of general correlation, the general lines in between sort of the graphics pipeline, traditional graphics pipeline, the things we've talked about, and how it's done in Unity 3D. And it'll be sort of similar in some other engines. Certainly the concepts and techniques will be similar. Sometimes the mechanics will be a little bit different. So wanted to have that on there. And we'll see how much we get to this. I also put please install Blender 2.83 or greater, just to sort of contrast the use of, or the creation of graphics in an offline tool like Blender, or if you're familiar with like Maya or Houdini, or any of these sort of effects packages or rendering packages or computer graphics packages that aren't really game real-time oriented. Right? So we can have a little bit of, we can load some models in, kind of see what the pipeline looks like, see what it looks like to render, see what tools are available. Not going to get deep into it. We're not going to, certainly, you're not going to be making advanced scenes in there. We're going to be doing really, really simple stuff like, loading a model, looking at what's available, see how the shading works, perhaps. Look how shading and materials work inside of Blender versus how shading and materials work inside of Unity, or what we're kind of used to. So I wanted to have you take some time to install those two things on your machine. They are available for Mac and Windows, so they're certainly completely cross-platform. We shouldn't have any issues with there. All right, so there's nothing for today. And it also would be nice that you may want to, with Blender perhaps, if you're creating assets for your final project, that's a good thing too. All right, so sometime between now and next week, do that. We'll probably start looking at it really later in the week rather than earlier in the week. The other piece I wanted to point out some things, because this is kind of my version of SIGGRAPH a little bit, since we can't take everybody to SIGGRAPH and see what's the latest and greatest going on in the industry and see people presenting papers and so on. But we do have YouTube. So there's lots of cool things in YouTube that kind of take a halfway between technical and sort of entertainment to kind of talk about computer graphics as they're being used sort of in the industry. Sometimes, there's lots of stuff in there about gaming as well. And there's bunches of things that sort of cross the lines between gaming and entertainment. And I wanted to kind of pull out a few examples of that. So for today, these sort of like extra assigned, and I'll give you extra time from class today. We probably won't go the full hour, so if you want to watch some of these videos, and I'll put out some, or refer to some specific parts of the videos to make sure you kind of hit the highlights up. So the first one was, or is, the virtual production of The Mandalorian, where they talk quite a bit about how the Unreal Engine and how virtual sets are used in The Mandalorian. And it's not exactly, some of you may have seen this set of The Mandalorian, and let's see, what's the easiest way if I just click on here, and I'm going to full screen this, and we'll do a little scrubbing around. One of the key things that they did on the set of The Mandalorian is they, rather than the traditional soundstage or the traditional green screen setup, they used a very high resolution LED wall and projected the backgrounds or scenes, not necessarily even, you can't have foreground in it, but so it's everything that's behind the actor or the action. I think this is a couple of different, maybe a part one, part two. It's kind of good. Here's a good reference here. You can see here's this cave that the Mandalorian and the child are in. I think or somebody's in the set. And so as they're filming, rather than use sort of a traditional green screen, completely synthetic background like the actors weren't there and everything gets added later, they would have this sound stage that they would project in real time using the Unreal Engine to create the background scene. Now, an interesting thing about that, I talked to a friend of mine, and he was, by the name of Blake Sloan, he gave the keynote at our Game Fest back in, I think it was in May. And at first I expected to talk to him and say, well, tell us all about how, they're doing this stuff instead of doing green screening. And, because that seems like the obvious thing to do. You perform in front of this screen, you don't need to do a green screen anymore. And he said, well, actually, in high production value things, that's not really the exciting part about what's going on here. And I said, really? What's the exciting part? And he says, well, it's actually that the lighting that is being cast on the scenery in the front, the characters, the real set pieces and so on, the lighting there is correct for that scene. So within this, if I stood, or the Mandalorian, whoever, stood in the middle of this scene, they would be lit appropriately as if they were in that space, right? So basically they would be environment mapped in the real space by that surrounding. I thought that was really kind of an interesting point. So for his perspective, that was the important part. Now, let's see, he wasn't on, he's at Marvel, which is part of Disney, so they have a different pipeline than the ILM folks on The Mandalorian. So I can't say, for sure that they're definitely not using background replacement using this as well. But from his perspective and from people he had talked to at Marvel, that was kind of one of the really neat things about this. So it's kind of interesting in that the technique of environment mapping and image-based lighting, which we referred to a little bit in, let's see, back over here, when we started talking a little bit about this physically based rendering, there's also a chapter here about image-based lighting, right, which is this idea that collection of techniques to light objects not by direct analytical lights, as in previously, but by treating the surrounding background as one big light source. Right? So they're creating sort of this hybrid image-based lighting on the set of The Mandalorian. So kind of interesting to see how these concepts wind up being put into use. Right? This is very different. They're not really, obviously this is not being calculated, but they're winding up with the physical version of this. Right? They're lighting the actors on the set according to the background, according to the actual environment. Right? That's effectively what's happening. Instead of having lots of point lights and the sun and all those different lights, they just use this LED wall to create the surrounding environment as if it were one big light source. So I thought that was a really kind of interesting side note on how this is playing out. Now, in some situations, so the question is, do they then take the image in the background and they've got everything, all the motion, all the camera telemetry, right? So they know exactly where the camera in this scene is physically, and then they can match that camera motion directly to a camera inside the virtual space. So if they actually are doing rendering, they can come up with an exact position for the camera. They know where the actor is, or the foreground scenes are, and then they can replace the background with even better versions, right? A full dynamic version, a full rendered version that would exceed the fidelity of the LED wall that was actually on the set. And so you'll notice there's, in the movie we don't see, or on the TV version, or wherever we are, we wind up, let's see, we don't see the seams. Well, here's one. They don't really have seams in that one. So some of them, it seemed like they were issues with regards to seams and whatnot. I guess you can kind of see. Now the background here looks a bit washed out. I don't know. Maybe that's the photography. So how much of the background then gets used, the in-camera version versus yet another replacement of it. Very interesting. All right. So that was one video, and I encourage you to watch that. We'll have a link for that. And let's see if I have, yeah. Oh, good. I think I have some links here. So there's a production company called the Corridor Crew. They've been on YouTube for quite a while, and they have a series called VFX Artists React to Bad and Great CGI. And they've been doing this for quite a while now. I don't know if they do one every week. And some portions of it are really great. And they just kind of, a lot of the time they talk about, sort of behind the scenes. They try to guess how effects are done and what techniques are done. And these folks here, they really do everything from a, Maya, Cinema 4D, a typical Hollywood production, film production, TV production point of view. Right? They have recently started doing stuff inside of Unreal Engine as well. So it is interesting to see game engines and game rendering technologies used for the really kind of fast stuff. But I'm going to put two videos here, and one of them is one of their earlier, so this is CGI 8, I'll give you the link to that. And there is a portion of this, maybe I can find, I'll just share, starting at that position here, copy. And this, over there in my, the interesting thing I want to point out is the Lego movie, the first Lego movie, not because of my own interest in Lego, but specifically they talk about the kind of breakthrough in lighting here, how they did the lighting in the Lego movie. And let's see if I can find one. I don't know if people online, are you able to hear that? Are you able to hear me at all? Are you there?
Oh, we can hear you. I don't think we can hear you.
Okay. Well, I'll just defer to you watching that then. And the nice thing that I want to call your attention to is the discussion of dynamic range. Right? What dynamic range is basically the range of the scene is going to be from 0 to 1, something like that. Like in the case of OpenGL, normally we think about color, each of the color values going from 0 to 1. So full white, bright white is 1, 1, 1, and black is 0, 0, 0. So we have a certain dynamic range that we can accommodate there. And the interesting thing is that the human eye is probably the most sensitive and the most important in terms of modeling the dynamic range of what the human eye can see and can perceive. But typically cameras have limited dynamic range, so they have a sort of more compressed range of values that they can record. And what typically happens at some point, given whatever sensor, whatever you're using, you'll see, here's a good example here, where there's, I don't know if that's a light or a panel or that's actually a camera, something is in front of this person's face, and the white, the brightness of here and the sky and the forehead, it all becomes kind of just mushed to the brightest value, right? We've lost any shadowing or anything there, right? And the question is, you've probably seen this, different, cheap cameras, everything blows out a lot sooner. A more expensive camera, Hollywood, Alexa, I forget now that I talk to Alexa all the time, there's, various higher end cameras that have like 22 f-stops worth of range, can basically keep all that detail, and then it's up to you later on, after you capture all that dynamic range, to figure out, all right, how do we fit that in? How do we map that into the particular output device that we have, like the computer display or your television or whatever color space you're working in? All right, so there's an interesting discussion of this dynamic range and how the Lego movie in their rendering kind of was a change in how a lot of CG production was done to take advantage of a new color space called ACES, which is a different lighting model that allowed them to really capture the dynamic range of a real camera, or even more, you could go even higher than that to get the proper effect when you aim something at the sun. How does these things blow out? How does the scene overall desaturate in terms of color? Right? The brighter things get, the more sort of washed out the color gets, but you can still see, detail in things. Right? So this is a really good discussion of kind of how dynamic range has changed and how our ability to model dynamic range has changed in the last couple years. So this is a really good discussion of that, and kind of the general things that make the movie feel that much more realistic. And they'll talk about all sorts of different things about surface detail and how the simulation down to the seams in the Lego pieces and so on. And that's ultimately about how the models are created. But the lighting is a particular interest here, and they're really good. They get into if you want to see The Mist is terrible. This is a Stephen King movie. They talk about compositing. So the challenges of compositing things like smoke versus simpler things like what do they have here? Well, anyway, compositing smoke over a scene where it's supposed to blend with the background. The challenges that artists or Hollywood sort of faces with that. So that's one want you to check out and watch in detail. And the other one is a more recent one, and I think this is the right one. Is this? Is it the right one? The one I wanted to, let's see, fine, go to their channel. They specifically talk about the work that's done at HBO. HBO Productions, when they do a movie or they do a series like something like, in this case, the Game of Thrones or Chernobyl or some other ones, they tend to go all out in terms of their CG, their graphics, and the attention to detail is kind of amazing. So if you do get a chance to watch this one as well, they'll talk about what's real and what is not in a lot of these scenes, and sort of how it's done and where most of the attention is paid in a production like this. So some really, really good use of discussion of the techniques and the passes of rendering that go on and so on. So let me post that one there as well. I'm finding that if I do individual posts, that is going to keep me from accidentally deleting the whole thing, which is what I did last time, so I don't do that. So I'll leave those two for you to kind of check out. And those two for the Carter Crew, and this one for the Mandalorian, to kind of talk about those things. Because I think they're appropriate for some of the other techniques we want to talk about today, where, boy, I got lots of different misspellings there. Deferred, there we go. Deferred rendering. Multi-target rendering, deferred rendering, and so on. Okay, so now we've got those. And we've got those, and here we are. All right, I think I've successfully rebuilt what I wanted to talk about on there. All right. So in terms of those techniques, the area that we're going to refer to today and look at some of today falls into the advanced lighting category in Learn OpenGL. We've talked a little about shadows and normal mapping. The main tag here for, or the main tab here, sorry, for advanced lighting is this shift between the kind of traditional Phong shading that we did in our normal ADS lighting model, and now the discussion of blend Phong shading, which adds or corrects for a particular type of problem that exists in the Phong lighting model, which is one of this assumption that the viewer is at a greater than, or typically greater than 90-degree angle from the light source in a scene, which winds up lending itself to this kind of harsh shadow effect here. Even when you're not trying to create a spotlight, you can wind up with these kind of unnaturally sharp shadows. And that's when you typically see that problem when the light is coming from that same angle, like in the right-hand side of the image here. So it works very well with the left side, but the right side, we start to have problems, right? With the theta being less than 90 degrees, the right image, we can see that. Or let's see, the other way around. We can see the angle theta between the reflection and the viewer is greater than 90 degrees, right? So the angle between not the light and the, gotta flip it. Flip what I said. It's the reflection and the viewer, not the light and the viewer, which are opposites. So anyway. So there's this addition, this change to the lighting model, or this new take on it, by another person by the name of Blinn. Somewhere here is his full name. Is it Richard? I forget. Anyway, and James F. Blinn, there we go. James F. Blinn is an extension to the Phong shading we've used so far, where instead of the relationship between the view angle and the reflection angle, it uses a relationship between the view angle and the normal, and then creates, the light source, the normal, to create this, what is the half vector. Basically, this is the half vector, which is half of the angle between the viewer and the light. And then the angle here is the angle between that half vector and the normal, right? Which is fairly easy to calculate. So we have this half vector, again, half vector, that is the one in between the view and the light, and then the angle being the distance between, the angle being angle between that half vector and the normal. And that's what gets used to figure out then where our drop-off occurs, right? So you can see the results of that. It's a pretty simple change here, right? So now the calculation of the specular term becomes the clamped dot product between the surface normal and that halfway vector. That's the big change. So simple change, much better soft lighting results. So that's Blinn Phong lighting versus Phong lighting. So if I were to ask what's the difference, we would say, well, Blinn adds the calculation of the half, let me get this terminology here, the halfway vector, which is halfway between the viewer and the light source, and relationship of that vector to the normal to calculate the specular term. Okay? All right. Now, so far that has nothing to do with camera and dynamic range and bloom and most of those other things, but wanted to mention that one. Let's see. Gamma correction. We'll just kind of plow through some of these. So gamma correction winds up kind of a first attempt at trying to map the brightness of a scene, or the brightness that we perceive, more accurately to what is represented. So in case you haven't noticed, we typically use a linear, or we think very linearly when we talk about light, or we talk about the color representation. We just say, okay, it goes from 0 to 1, and if we want to fade in, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up to 100, or 0.01 all the way up, right? So we work in that space. We think of it very linearly. Now, the human eye and certain monitors, they don't actually work that way. They have more or less sensitivity as they get towards black and full bright. So gamma correction is a way to take advantage of knowing about those types of relationships so that we can map the image more appropriately to the output or the viewing, whatever's viewing the image. You'll see this in a lot of games where there's always that, when you're calibrating, I think we may have talked, did we talk about this at one point? Maybe I have mentioned it briefly. At the beginning of lots of games, there's always like, okay, adjust this image until you can barely see the pattern against the background, right? See, in a lot of dark games, all your horror, survival horror games and all that sort of stuff, where you want to have like lots and lots of shadow in the details, or details in the shadows, right? So there's all sorts of things lurking there. So you can adjust the range, adjust the gamma to make sure that very small details in the black area have a more pronounced effect or more pronounced range so that you can actually see them on the monitor, right? So that's this adjustment here. So a difference in 0 to 1 in your graphic, in your source, might get amplified instead to 0 to 2 or 0 to something like that, so that you can discern those shadows and so on. Right? Here's an example where without gamma correction, black tends to get crushed, and well, the bright parts aren't so bad here, but our blacks, our shadows get kind of crushed and we lose a lot of detail. Right? So gamma correction can be done fairly easily, and OpenGL actually has a way to sort of to tell it, well, okay, the frame buffer that you're rendering, we can apply a gamma correction to it, or you could even do it inside of a shader, and that's pretty much a mapping or just a lookup sort of thing, right? So this is a simple conversion. Gamma correction is pretty straightforward. All right. So that's the main idea of a simple mapping of a linear scale to a dynamic range that matches more either the human eye or the monitor or whatever input or output device we're concerned with. So that's gamma correction. Shadows we already talked about, so we're going to leave that off for today. Normal mapping we also already talked about. The idea of creating surface detail through the use of a texture map that provides per fragment normals, right? So we're getting into that realm of sort of our micro faceting or a micro detail on surfaces. Now, parallax mapping, I hadn't seen this one before until Learn OpenGL, and this is kind of an interesting one. It's sort of similar to the idea of normal mapping, except, well, it's kind of a hybrid somewhere between normal mapping and sort of a height map. Now remember, for each of these, you wind up calculating in your vertex shader as usual, you calculate a texture coordinate, and then that becomes a varying across the whole surface. And what we can do here is we can modify that texture lookup depending on the relationship of that surface, right? That's kind of what happened in our normal mapping, but now in parallax mapping we can also kind of shift around the surface depending on how far it is from the viewer, right? Everyone should hopefully be a little bit familiar with the concept of parallax. Again, in a lot of 2D games we use this concept of parallax scrolling, so that things in the distance, like if you have a distant background, it moves. If the player is moving from left to right across the scene, the background will shift at a different rate than things that are closer to the camera. Right? There's a different sort of relationship between how things are perceived to move close to the camera versus far away from the camera. Right? So things kind of have a what's called parallax shift there. So this is a way of doing that at sort of this micro level, where we're saying, okay, certain things, certain details are further away, so we're going to shift the texture coordinates based on this parallax map. Right? So parallax mapping uses a simple 2D plane, calculating the tangent and bitangent vectors and so on according to our typical models that we've had so far for the normal mapping. And then we figure out, okay, based on that, we now take into account how far, the height of the spot that we're trying to render. And do we have another diagram? No, we don't. All right, so we will effectively shift the pixel coordinates to be this one, or one that would be, let's see, the displacement map is the inverse of the height map. Start of this chapter. Parallax mapping makes more sense to use the inverse of the height map, easier to fake depth. Slightly changes how we perceive parallax mapping as shown below. All right, so instead of seeing this spot here, we see this spot up here. All right, so we're projecting in and then taking the further offset to create the texture at that point on the surface. Right. So parallax mapping, that one's kind of an unusual one. I think this one doesn't show up in most of the texts I've seen, but it is an interesting technique to kind of, another form of sort of faking the, giving the illusion of height. Right. So, parallax mapping. Now, finally, we're getting into the sort of dynamic range concepts I wanted to talk about today. And first off being HDR, right, the high dynamic range. And this shows up in a lot of cameras. It shows up now in newer television sets, in any type of output devices. We're talking about, higher color depths and so on. So ways to basically display things with more fidelity and more detail when it comes to light and shadow. Right? Normally, by default, in OpenGL and a lot of other systems, the brightness and color values are clamped between 0 and 1, and that's what gets stored in the frame buffer. So how do we do high dynamic range? Basically, instead of using a fixed point frame buffer, we can use a floating point frame buffer with more resolution, with greater range, and render into that instead of rendering into a traditional clamped frame buffer that goes only between 0 and 1. What does that mean? For practical purposes, here's what may happen. Imagine you have two light sources, and each of them is shining on a white background, and each of those light sources effectively wants to make the pixel, the fragment at that location, 1. It wants to make it pure white. So if two light sources hit with that same intensity, that should be greater than 1. Right? That seems easy enough to conceptualize. So that's the idea. We allow, in our high dynamic range render buffer, to go above what the normal range would do. And then ultimately, we then have a mapping, sort of, you can think of it as a, it's not exactly the gamma adjustment or gamma correction that we talked about before, but it's called, in this case, tone mapping, which will then take our high dynamic range image and allow us to tone map that into the range of the device, which may also involve a gamma correction as that happens as well. So high HDR, largely the enabling concept is this using floating point frame buffers instead of our normal fixed point color format that would be from 0 to 1. It allows us to exceed that, but of course then we have to convert back down from that floating point to a fixed point so that we can display it. Right? So this involves a rendering pass to our floating point buffer, and then later on another pass that we're going to do that tone map to the screen space. Okay? And there are various techniques. One of the more simple tone mapping algorithms, the Reinhard tone mapping. So lots of different ways to kind of come up with the appropriate one. That's the one that they reference in here. So you'll see, like I mentioned, Reinhard tone mapping algorithm evenly balances out the brightness values onto the low dynamic range, and then includes Reinhard tone mapping into the previous shader, and also adds a gamma correction filter for good measure, including the use of sRGB textures. So often you'll see this combination, right? We'll do a high dynamic range floating point render, then we'll tone map it to get it into the correct range, and then we'll do a gamma correction, because that's really about, you know, the monitor, not creating the look that we want. All right, we're accommodating a monitor or a viewer, as opposed to where do we want detail and in our image. All right. So I'll leave it to you to read this all in detail after that. This is why the world looks more real than things on screens, or used to look more real than things on screens. Things on screens are getting awfully realistic these days. So one other real-world effect, and sometimes, I don't know, I'm convinced that my eyes certainly do this. I guess perhaps the older you get, the more kind of floaters you have in your eyes, the more, you know, with age this comes, and certain types of vision. But it's more recognized as sort of a camera effect. Famously, someone figured out how to do this bloom effect, and then it got overused an awful lot. I think if we go back to the video we watched at the very beginning of the video, I asked you to watch at the very beginning, the history of game graphics. There's a section talking about, you know, when someone discovered bloom, and suddenly it became everywhere. It was largely with the one of the Tron games that came out. And Tron, the movie, dating all the way back to the 80s, one of the key looks of that film was this bloom kind of effect. And what that is basically because of the way that the camera or the viewer, the dynamic range of the viewer, not only will certain parts tend to blow out, but their surrounding area will be affected. So even though they're not normally lit that way, we get this kind of blooming or kind of blurred extra lighting in these kind of blown out areas, right? Bright light sources and brightly lit regions are often difficult to convey to the viewer as the intensity range of the monitor is limited. One way to distinguish really bright light sources on the monitor, make them glow. The light bleeds around the light source, right? Gives the illusion that these light sources or bright regions are intensely bright. So this light bleed. So bloom is also known as light bleed or glow effect. Key terms there. Often achieved with a post-processing effect called bloom. Now, so getting into post-processing, key thing there is with the moment I hear that, I say, okay, well, chances are we're doing some sort of multi-pass rendering. We render the scene, we can figure out the lights in the scene, and then we have to figure out, okay, there's light potentially that's affecting pixels that weren't just part of our calculation. Right? We've got this sort of indirect light from these brightly lit things. Right? These aren't emissive light sources necessarily. These are just things that wind up being really intense. So one of the typical ways this is done is as a multi-pass or post-process effect, where we render the whole scene, then we look at the scene, we look for the areas that basically are at full intensity or near full intensity, and create that effect around and apply that to the whole image. Right? So this is a really good candidate for some sort of multi-pass rendering. It's typically used in combination with HDR rendering, right? And because of that, we can just basically, you know, figure out when do we exceed the threshold that we were interested in. And this is one of those techniques, like I said, it can use multiple passes, or there's another technique, another concept of having multiple render targets where we can render different parts of a scene or different information about the scene into different target buffers simultaneously. Right? So implementing Bloom, we render the lit scene as usual, extract the scene's HDR color buffer, and an image on the scene that is only the bright regions visible. So we're going to need to take two different things on here, the normal HDR, and then somehow synthesize the areas that need to be blurred or get brightness blurred into them. And I'll let you read through this, but you can see the end result is we have the normal scene, the bright regions, the blurred bright regions, and then the combination. So this is what's going on here, right? One pass gives us this, then we have some other passes to create this blurred version of that image, and then the result. So here's where we get this multiple buffer, multi-target rendering, multiple render targets. So the first step requires us to extract two images from a rendered scene. You could, or you may be thinking, okay, well that means if you have two versions, you need to render it twice. That's what we would have done if we weren't able to do this. But we can set up multiple render targets and then decide what goes in each of them. So in our fragment buffer, our fragment shader, excuse me, normally we have our frag color, which is at layout location 0. We've used that all the time. But you can specify in the shader, and after some setup in our, on our CPU side, we set a different location that's going to have our secondary target, our secondary render target. You can have, I don't know what the certain limitations, you can probably not have infinite ones, but in this case we have two. So here you can see setting up floating point frame buffer to render to, and then setting up the two color buffers. And the key down here is setting up here the color attachment 0 and color attachment, plus some index here. So we want it with two versions of these render buffers. Right. So that's the key piece here. So in one pass, we can create two images, right? Because they're both relying on the same source. One doesn't rely on the other. Right? So we can simultaneously create the two of those. This talks a bit about Gaussian blur as well. A typical filter that we use in lots of different things, a Gaussian distribution of blur, is where we wind up creating softness at edges by basically averaging a certain number of pixels at a certain distance from each to create blur effect. It's probably all, well, I don't know if everyone has. Maybe I just assume. I've done it a million times in Photoshop. If something's too sharp or you want to blur out some detail or something like that, you always reach for the Gaussian blur, kind of a super, super standard post-processing effect, where you, instead of taking just the pixel you're on, you wind up blur it vertically and horizontally. So you take averages across the two, and you wind up creating a Gaussian blur. So I'll leave you to read the details on this, but that's the main concept, right? You create an overlit texture, a normal texture, and then blur the overlit version and combine it with the other. Right? So that's Bloom. Now we could use that. The important part is not so much that everyone should put Bloom in their games, but getting used to this notion of, yes, you can render to multiple targets in the same shader. And that turns out to be one of the things that gets used here in deferred shading. So efficiency. That becomes one of the things, even though we have lots and lots of GPU cores with lots of compute power and so on, there still winds up being limits. And certainly the more light sources you have in the scene, the more fragments you have in the scene, the more geometry you have in the scene, it all just escalates. And you can never have enough. Right? We haven't reached that point yet where you can have enough compute. Always want more. So deferred shading is one technique that winds up being used to kind of help with that a bit. Because there are certain things that you might notice that don't necessarily need to be calculated as often as they do in the naive model, especially with regards to lighting. Right? So as we go through, and even if we're doing a fairly smart version of culling and so on, you may wind up doing lots of lighting calculations for things that aren't ultimately going to be rendered. Something else gets rendered on top, and you've done all the wonderful math in terms of calculating the half vectors and the normals and all that sort of thing. And ultimately, they can't be seen. So the question is, how can we take advantage of, how can we calculate just, say, maybe the basic sort of things and figure out, okay, calculate the geometry of the scene down to the fragment level, and the important information like the things that we would use in lighting, like the normal maps and the half vector and so on and so on. But then only do the expensive calculations for things that actually wind up on the scene, or on the screen, excuse me. Right? So especially with things like having lots and lots and lots of light sources, you could say, well, okay, only render the fragments that wind up being visible, right? So you can limit the amount of calculations this way. So key part here, deferred shading or deferred rendering aims to overcome these issues by drastically changing the way we render objects. Several new options to significantly optimize scenes with larger number of lights especially. Right. So normal shading we refer to as forward rendering, where we're always, every pass we move forward, we never look back at what came before necessarily. But deferred shading, based on the idea that we defer or postpone most of the heavy rendering, like the lighting piece, to some later stage where we know more about what is really on the scene. Typically, deferred shading consists of two passes, and the first pass is the geometry pass, where we get, like I said, the geometry for not just the vertices, but now we can get geometry more or less on a fragment level. Right? Render the scene once and retrieve all kinds of geometrical information from the objects that we store in a collection of textures called the G buffer. So remember the G buffer. That is our special buffer, our geometry buffer in the case of deferred shading or deferred rendering. Containing position vectors, color vectors, normal vectors, and potentially specular values. Right. It looks something like this. So we actually do wind up with, you could think of it being, the unshaded version would just be our albedo, which would be kind of our flat textured model. If we could visualize what our specular highlights look like, this is what they would be. And then we'd have even, the position. So in our buffer, we wind up with a position of each fragment in the scene. If we rendered it, it would look like this, with our things tending to wind up looking pink towards the front. Or 111, I guess. Not quite all the way in the front, but anyway. Then, after you've created the geometry buffer, the second pass, the lighting pass, you render a screen-filled quad. So like our off-screen texture that we used when we had our lots and lots of shiny RPI cubes that wound up being just part of an IM GUI texture. We could then use that to really create that lit pass. So we create the geometry, we get the G buffer, which has all of our important information on a fragment by fragment basis, but limited to what we're really going to be rendering, and then combining those, doing those calculations in a lighting pass. Right. So that's the main concept of deferred rendering and using a geometry pass and a lighting pass. And in this, this chapter of the Learn OpenGL text, or on the Learn OpenGL site, they go further and say, okay, after we've rendered that, then what can we do? Can we add other things to the scene? They take yet another pass and combine it with some cubes and so on, and go through some other optimizations and so on and so on. But that is the key idea behind implementing bloom and deferred shading and high dynamic range, all these things, all these deferred rendering and multiple render targets are the things that enable that. And last but not least for today, the good old-fashioned ambient lighting. You remember that just being sort of the thing that would be, if there's no light in the scene, if there's no light that hits a particular fragment, we're going to give it just a little bit, just a little kick potentially to say, all right, we can kind of see it's there. We're going to assume there's some sort of bounced light that hit it. So what we want to do is be smarter. The idea behind this, and after lack of oxygen, the screen space ambient occlusion. There we are, SSAO, screen space ambient occlusion, is a more sophisticated way to go about this by actually looking at the geometry to say, okay, given things like corners, creases, and other relationships between the geometry, how likely is ambient light to get into that area? How likely is the ambient light to be occluded, to be prevented from getting into those areas? That's why we call it ambient occlusion in this case. Right? We're occluding ambient light, preventing ambient light from hitting certain areas. So, pretty good example here. Without screen-spaced ambient occlusion, there's none of these kind of just sort of default shadows behind this phone booth here. Wow, a payphone. What a quaint thing to show, right? Has anyone in this class actually ever used a payphone? Been a long time since I have. All right, so the idea, one type of indirect lighting approximation is called ambient occlusion that tries to approximate indirect lighting by darkening the creases, holes, and surfaces that are potentially close to one another. Right? They are largely occluded by surrounding geometry, and thus light rays have fewer places to escape to. Hence, the areas appear darker. All right, that's the basic idea. Involves yet another use of creating the G buffer so that we know the geometry of the scene, because we wouldn't want to do this on an entire scene level, right? That's why it's screen space, right? We're not doing it in the model space or the world space. We're doing it with regards to what can be seen on the screen. So we are going to use our G buffer to handle that. It's a little bit more complicated than we want to be in terms of the, let's see, we'll get down here to the actual shader. It's kind of split up across a bunch of things here. So it winds up looking through multiple texels, looking through multiple fragments to create these blurry areas around sharp changes in depth, right? Because we have that depth in the geometry, so we can see, okay, how much are things varying? So we can see steep changes, right? It's not the overall change, it's where it's steeply, where it's sharply changing. That's where occlusion happens. At these corners, it's a sharp change in the geometry. These flat planes are a much smoother change, right? Where we suddenly change direction. We're perpendicular, we're going to tend to have sharper lines like this. And we know that those are areas where we get, some dirt in the corners, basically. So there's our ambient occlusion version. So you can see why we might not want to do that arbitrarily and instead focus it on the screen space. Okay. So those are the techniques I wanted to talk about today. I'm going to let you go. It's kind of weird, I guess, now thinking to myself, it used to be, I was watching, actually this is all because I was playing a video game. I was watching or playing Octopath Traveler. And I don't know how many of you have played Octopath Traveler or not. But the first character by default, somehow I wind up playing the character of the Professor Cyrus, I guess is the scholar. And he's teaching class, and he says, well, and at the end of the class, he says, okay, so now everyone read chapters 2 and 3, and that's, your assignment to go off. And I said, well, okay. So I'm going to view this one as sort of that same way. So we've hit the topics, we've kind of flowed through them real quickly. And what I'd recommend, it's not going to be a requirement that you put any of these things in your final project, but you should read through these. Thankfully, it already has like highlighted versions, of things like ambient occlusion, scattering, highlighted terms. But you should go back and read through these as if they were the chapters of the book. Make some notes to yourself about, things that you think are important concepts and so on, so that, if they show up on kind of the homework or they show up on the exam, that's where they should be coming from. All right. I think I got grades out to everybody with regards to the proposals. The proposals. I'm pretty happy with everything. Lots of leeway in terms of the proposals. It's always going to be about ultimately the implementation. As usual, some people are being extra ambitious, and I look forward to seeing the results on that. I posted some notes, and certainly as things go forward, and there's room for changes, pivots, flexes, whatever you want to do. If you wind up being super inspired by something and do want to change, that's okay. But at least you have some sort of roadmap to begin from for today. All right, if there's no questions on this, I'm just going to hope that you're inspired and go further and actually read through, maybe even get some of the code and compile it and try it out. And also do watch some of specifically those two videos from the Corridor crew and about the Mandalorian. Think about, how are these things being used? How do these things relate to other fields, or, the blurring between other fields now? Seeing Unreal Engine used a lot in live production and film production, TV production, pre-visualization, commercials, all kinds of interesting things. I'm sure Unity does it as well, but somehow Unreal, maybe it's because it showed up in the Mandalorian videos so prominently that everybody's thinking that's the way to go. Have a great weekend. Make progress on your projects, and do get those Unity and Blender installed, and we'll kind of look at some of that stuff firsthand next week. Thanks for your attention.
Yeah, I had a quick question.
Oh, sure.
I remember a while back when you were talking about the syllabus. I'm just a little bit confused about the final, and it's like we can choose like a topic and not take the final and write about a topic.
Yes, if you want to create, there isn't the buyout from the. There are a couple of ways to buy out from that test. If you want to choose sort of an extra topic that would be something, it should be different than your project, so it shouldn't be just something that's an add-on to your project. And normally be something like, if you saw a particular paper, or you can kind of think of it as an extra, almost a, what's the difference between a sort of a thesis and a project when you're doing your master's or your terminal project. But you should propose a topic that you want to do a short paper on, and you should go into enough depth on it to warrant it, again, not being as in-depth as your final project, but certainly because of the way the point values break down, it should be reasonably in-depth. So we're talking about 3+ pages on that.
So if I find like a really cool cigarette paper that I found interesting, I can write about that?
If it's a paper, probably want to see maybe some implementation more than just kind of feedback on it. So there should be some like sort of additional depth to it. It shouldn't just be a reaction.
Wait, you're supposed to implement?
Not necessarily, not necessarily. Not implement the whole thing, but talk about, kind of just go a little bit more in depth. It could be like, more like pseudocode. How would you do it? Not full on.
Yeah,
But it can't just be like, this is a cool technique. I found this really interesting. It could be like, well, okay, given this, I could see implementing this in OpenGL using these techniques and kind of going a little bit, kind of not all the way to proof of concept, but imagine getting something greenlit for a project. So it's got to be a little bit more in depth than a reaction paper, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. No, I didn't mean react about it. I meant actually write in depth on
Sure. Yep.
the actual technique used and how one would implement it.
That would be great.
Okay.
Yep.
So if I find a good paper, should I like post it in Discord first to see if it's acceptable?
Right. Do let me know what the topic is going to be. So don't just go out and write a paper and assume that that's it. But yeah, find the topic, propose the topic as a paper topic, and then go from there. Yep.
I'll put it in the topic chat then. All right,
Okay.
thank you.
Great.